The winter of 1944 descended on the Ardennes with an unforgiving cold, shrouding the forested hills in snow and fog. For the German forces, the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was intended to be a bold and decisive strike against the Allies, a surprise maneuver aimed at breaking through the dense Allied lines and seizing critical territory. Months of planning, logistical coordination, and strategic calculation had been invested to ensure the offensive would succeed. Commanders meticulously plotted troop movements, armored advances, and artillery support, confident that the element of surprise and the harsh winter conditions would favor their assault. Yet, amidst this carefully orchestrated plan, an unseen and revolutionary force lay in wait, poised to alter the course of the battle in ways the Germans could never have anticipated: the proximity fuse. Unlike conventional artillery shells, which required a direct hit to inflict maximum damage, the proximity fuse was an innovation of unparalleled lethality. Designed to detonate when it sensed the presence of a nearby target, it transformed even dispersed units into vulnerable targets, capable of being annihilated without ever being directly struck. The Americans had secretly deployed these fuses in key sectors, embedding them within artillery rounds whose destructive potential would reveal itself in horrifying detail. For the German soldiers advancing into the Ardennes, trained to anticipate conventional fire and to operate within known tactical frameworks, the effects of the proximity fuse were nothing short of bewildering. Entire formations could vanish in moments, vehicles and tanks destroyed in mid-convoy, and infantry decimated before they could respond. The invisible nature of the weapon turned the forest into a deadly labyrinth, where fear, confusion, and disorientation were as lethal as the artillery itself. As the German columns moved through snow-laden roads and forested paths, initial encounters with the fuse's effects sparked shock and disbelief. Experienced officers, hardened by years on the eastern and western fronts, struggled to comprehend reports of entire battalions being wiped out in near silence. Soldiers whispered of explosions that seemed to come from nowhere, and of the eerie efficiency with which the new weapons struck. The psychological impact was immediate. Fear replaced confidence, caution replaced aggression, and momentum, the key to any successful offensive, was halted before it could fully develop. The Ardennes, previously regarded as a terrain offering both cover and tactical advantage, became a perilous maze in which every step carried the risk of sudden annihilation. The winter of 1944 had descended on the Ardennes with a sinister stillness, coating the forests and villages in a brittle, deceptive quiet. Snow, heavy and relentless, blanketed the twisting roads, concealing potholes, frozen puddles, and the scars of months of warfare. The German High Command, anticipating a late December offensive, moved their units through these frozen corridors with meticulous care. They were confident that their meticulously planned attack, the Ardennes counteroffensive, would be the hammer blow that broke the Allied front. Yet, unbeknownst to them, a weapon of subtlety and innovation lay in wait: the proximity fuse, a small device with an unimaginable capacity for destruction. Unlike traditional shells that required direct impact, these fuses were designed to detonate when they sensed the nearness of a target, rendering conventional infantry formations, tanks, and artillery positions catastrophically vulnerable. In the early hours of December 16th, the first columns of German armor and infantry began their advance. Snow crunching under tracks and boots, men whispered reassurances to one another, trying to mask the fear gnawing at their spines. These were experienced soldiers, hardened on the eastern and western fronts, yet there was an undercurrent of unease. Reports had trickled in of Allied artillery becoming unnervingly precise, hitting positions that should have remained hidden. Yet the German commanders dismissed such murmurs as exaggeration. After all, they had faced heavy fire before and survived. They had studied the terrain, timed the attack to exploit foggy mornings, and synchronized their movements to the minute. Their confidence was palpable, yet fragile. resting on the assumption that the enemy was as vulnerable and predictable as they had always been. The American units stationed in the Ardennes were in stark contrast to their German counterparts. Though caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the German plan, the Allies had quietly begun implementing new defensive measures. Radar-guided artillery and experimental munitions, including shells equipped with proximity fuses, had been deployed in secret sectors. These fuses, top-secret technology, functioned by detecting the electromagnetic signature of approaching metal, detonating above or near a target with devastating effectiveness. For infantry, this meant that even spread-out units could be obliterated without a direct hit. For tanks and vehicles, the explosive shockwave could shred armor and ignite fuel simultaneously. The Americans understood the potential of this technology to level the battlefield, yet most soldiers remained unaware of its exact mechanics. Only the officers understood the lethal difference between a normal shell and a proximity-fused one. As dawn broke, the mist hung thick in the Ardennes, veiling the German advance from distant observation posts. The columns crept along narrow roads, some vehicles cutting through forests to flank positions that were theoretically unguarded. Artillery pieces rumbled in the distance, and the occasional crackle of small arms fire echoed faintly through the trees. The Germans, confident in their ability to punch through, failed to notice the subtle signs of the trap. Birds startled into flight by unseen explosions, snow-laden branches trembling without wind, and the faint, eerie whistle of shells that seemed to appear from nowhere. In the first hour of the attack, a few reconnaissance units encountered the new threat. Tanks were riddled before they could react, and infantry squads found themselves enveloped in fiery clouds that erupted not from direct hits, but proximity. Panic spread rapidly as seasoned soldiers realized that the ground itself had become hostile in ways previously unimaginable. By mid-morning, the full scope of the catastrophe began to unfold. German commanders, initially confident in their maps and timing, were confronted with reports of entire units vanishing. Company after company was decimated by what could only be described as omnipresent artillery detonating with an intelligence that defied comprehension. The proximity fuses had achieved what months of conventional warfare could not: the systematic dismantling of an attacking force without the need for strategic brilliance. Allied observers, stationed in hidden bunkers and listening posts, watched with grim satisfaction as German morale crumpled under a weapon they could not see and scarcely understand. This was a turning point, a demonstration of how innovation, secrecy, and precise execution could alter the course of battles almost instantaneously. By nightfall, the surviving German units were in disarray. Commanders, desperate to reorganize, faced a stark reality. The Ardennes offensive, meticulously planned for months, had been unraveled within hours. Entire regiments had been reduced to smoldering wreckage, and the survivors moved in small, fragmented groups, constantly under the threat of the unseen artillery. Rumors spread among the troops of ghost shells and invisible guns, the proximity fuses achieving almost a mythical reputation in whispered accounts. Morale, already fragile due to harsh winter conditions and prior setbacks, reached breaking points as soldiers confronted the horrifying efficiency of this new technology. The night was punctuated by sporadic artillery fire, the sound echoing through the trees like the laughter of fate itself, reminding the Germans that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The implications of these initial encounters were not lost on the higher echelons of the German command. Staff officers, poring over dispatches and field reports, debated endlessly the nature of the destruction. Some believed it to be the result of clandestine Allied observation posts, while others speculated about new types of bombs or explosive devices. None fully grasped the truth. The proximity fuse was a force multiplier of unparalleled scale. By the end of Part 1, the Ardennes offensive had already lost its momentum before it truly began, the German high command reeling under a combination of shock, confusion, and the cold, hard realization of technological inferiority. The morning after the first wave of destruction, the Ardennes forest seemed almost unrecognizable. What had been a path for armored columns and marching infantry now lay twisted under the weight of annihilation. Burned-out tanks, half-melted vehicles, and the remnants of trucks and artillery littered the snow, creating a grotesque landscape that stretched for miles. The snow itself, once pure and white, had turned a ghastly patchwork of red and black streaks, marred by shattered metal and the remnants of uniforms. The survivors of the German advance moved cautiously, their movements shadowed by fear, haunted by the sudden loss of entire comrades in what felt like invisible hands. Proximity fuses had rewritten the rules of engagement. Formations, once the backbone of tactical doctrine, were now liabilities, ensuring maximum casualties rather than coordinated firepower. German officers scrambled to regroup their forces. The scale of disarray was staggering. Radio transmissions, when they worked, were garbled with panic-filled voices shouting coordinates and reporting units that no longer existed. Supply lines were fractured, and armored support was reduced to scattered remnants. The concept of offensive momentum was meaningless in the face of technology that could annihilate concentrated forces from the air and beyond line of sight. Reconnaissance teams set ahead were obliterated before even reaching the main columns, leaving commanders blind to the terrain and the enemy. Maps were useless. The forest had transformed into a lethal labyrinth, every tree and snowbank a potential death trap. The men who remained were forced into improvisation, moving individually or in tiny clusters to avoid presenting a detectable mass to the deadly fuses above. The Americans, meanwhile, observed the unfolding chaos from hidden artillery emplacements. Officers and radar operators noted with grim satisfaction the efficiency of their defensive technology. Each shell, equipped with its proximity fuse, seemed to anticipate German movements with uncanny precision. For the troops on the ground, it was as if the forest itself had turned hostile, erupting in fire and steel without warning. Soldiers who had survived the initial barrage described the explosions as raining from nowhere, the sound of metal tearing and bodies being hurled through the air, mingling with the natural creaks and groans of the winter woods. Many could scarcely comprehend what had befallen their comrades. Those who had trained for conventional combat found themselves confronting an enemy that was not just human, but technological, a force that acted with invisible, almost intelligent malice. As hours passed, the psychological toll on the German forces became evident. Small units, isolated and terrified, huddled in the remnants of ruined buildings and hollowed-out trenches, their breaths misting in the freezing air. Survivors described seeing entire regiments vanish as if swallowed by the snow and smoke, a disconcerting blend of fire and silence that defied logic. Officers attempted to enforce discipline, issuing orders to regroup, form defensive positions, and push forward, but the fear was contagious. Men began to distrust their own leaders, abandoning positions to flee or hide, their movements uncoordinated and haphazard. The proximity fuse had done more than kill, it had shattered morale, transforming battle-hardened soldiers into haunted figures crawling through snow-choked fields. Amid the chaos, small acts of heroism emerged. Some German soldiers, realizing the futility of massed formations, displayed remarkable ingenuity. They used the forest as cover, moving stealthily, setting traps for pursuing American scouts, and salvaging equipment from destroyed vehicles. Engineers attempted to study the effects of the new weapon, examining crater patterns and debris, searching for vulnerabilities in what seemed like an omnipotent system. Yet for every success, countless failures reminded them of the fuse's overwhelming lethality. Vehicles that had been thought safe were detonated in mid-approach. Armored columns that attempted to flank were obliterated from above, the explosions precise enough to incapacitate entire platoons simultaneously. The psychological pressure compounded the physical danger, creating a sense that no maneuver was safe, no position permanent, and no survival guaranteed. The landscape itself became an active participant in the unfolding horror. The snow, interspersed with blood and shattered metal, muffled footsteps, making the movement of troops both stealthy and treacherous. Frozen rivers, once natural barriers, were shattered by indirect fire, sending torrents of ice and water cascading over men and equipment. Trees, splintered by shell blasts, created obstacles and hazards, while the dense forest concealed the continuing threat of proximity-fused artillery from unseen American positions. Even the wind seemed to carry menace, whistling through branches and amplifying the echoes of distant explosions. Soldiers spoke of the forest as if it had a consciousness, aware of their movements, ready to betray them. This mental strain added to the physical toll, breaking down cohesion and undermining discipline at every turn. Reports of entire German units annihilated reached the higher command, spreading panic in strategic headquarters. Staff officers and generals had to face the grim reality. Their most carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing before their eyes, undone by technology they could neither predict nor counter. Attempts to reroute forces, consolidate remaining troops, and launch counterattacks were largely ineffective. Every movement seemed anticipated, as though the proximity fuses themselves had strategic awareness, striking at the most vulnerable points. Morale, already shaken by the initial onslaught, now plunged into despair. Soldiers who had survived the first onslaught faced the double burden of fear and exhaustion, their bodies and minds taxed to the brink. Orders were ignored or delayed, and coordination disintegrated into fragmented skirmishes scattered across the frozen forest. Amid the snow-covered chaos, American units adapted rapidly, exploiting the advantages conferred by the proximity fuses. Commanders observed the patterns of German retreat, redirecting artillery fire to anticipated fallback routes, creating successive layers of destruction. Infantry, shielded by the fuse's indirect action, maneuvered with confidence, supporting each other and maintaining communication in ways the Germans could not. For them, this was a surreal opportunity, a battlefield where innovation amplified tactical advantage exponentially. They could anticipate enemy movement with a degree of certainty unthinkable in traditional combat, while the Germans were forced to improvise, often blindly, under constant threat. The imbalance of information, technology, and morale became the defining factor of the engagement, turning what might have been a conventional battle into a theater dominated by invisible, almost omnipotent firepower. By nightfall, the forest was littered with the remnants of German ambition. Survivors huddled together for warmth, sharing sparse rations, while recounting horrors that defied belief. Entire companies had been obliterated, supply chains destroyed, and communications severed. The proximity fuses had not merely killed, they had transformed the battlefield into a theater of psychological warfare, where fear of the invisible enemy became as deadly as the explosions themselves. Officers documented these encounters in grim detail, trying to understand the mechanics and plan for recovery, but the magnitude of the losses defied traditional analysis. As the cold night pressed in, it was clear to all ranks. The Ardennes offensive was no longer a coordinated push, it was a desperate struggle for survival. A chaotic retreat through snow, fire, and shadow, haunted by an unseen force that moved faster, struck harder, and demanded no surrender. The morning following the initial chaos brought with it a bitter clarity. The Ardennes offensive, as meticulously planned by the German High Command, had dissolved into a nightmare of shattered formations and indiscriminate destruction. What had been intended as a swift, decisive push toward the Meuse River was now a fragmented and demoralized advance, where the concept of coordinated action had become a relic of pre-proximity fuse thinking. Snow crunched under the boots of the remaining German soldiers, the frost biting through even the thickest winter coats, yet no chill compared to the icy dread that gripped their hearts. Every tree seemed a potential death trap, every shadow a harbinger of the next explosive strike. The proximity-fused shells had not merely killed, they had broken the very rhythm of warfare the Germans relied upon. Commanders attempted to reorganize. Small groups of officers gathered around fractured maps in frozen dugouts, their breath clouding in the frigid air, as they tried to locate where the surviving units had fallen back. Reports were sporadic, contradictory, and often horrifying. Entire battalions had been reduced to smoldering wrecks, tanks incinerated before they could engage, trucks obliterated in mid-convoy. Panic permeated the ranks. Soldiers refused orders, abandoning positions, or fleeing into the forest, hoping that invisibility and distance might shield them. The concept of holding lines, of massed firepower, had been rendered obsolete by the invisible enemy above. Any attempt at conventional maneuver invited catastrophic loss, and commanders struggled to conceive of alternative tactics, for the old playbook was useless against a weapon that detonated in proximity rather than on contact. The shattered German advance was further complicated by the terrain itself. The Ardennes, dense with trees and riddled with ravines and frozen streams, offered both refuge and trap. Men who scattered into the forest discovered the subtle, insidious reach of the proximity-fused artillery. Even when separated by hundreds of meters, soldiers were not safe. Explosions erupted from seemingly empty spaces, uprooting trees, tearing apart vehicles, and creating maelstroms of fire, snow, and debris. Survivors described a sense of disorientation, as if the forest itself had conspired against them. Frozen rivers that might have offered escape routes became death traps as indirect artillery fire shattered ice, sending torrents of icy water and splintered timber crashing down upon the unprepared. Every step was fraught with mortal danger, every breath potentially the last, and the psychological toll was as punishing as the physical wounds inflicted. Meanwhile, small pockets of organized German resistance tried to salvage what they could. Engineers and combat engineers worked frantically to assess damage and recover any functional equipment. Improvised defensive positions were erected wherever possible. Half-collapsed barns, hollowed-out trenches, and natural depressions in the snow became temporary refuges. Men took turns keeping watch, scanning for the telltale whistling or distortion in the air that heralded another proximity-fused shell. Yet even these precautions often failed. Survivors recounted moments of stark horror when entire defensive positions were wiped out in a single eruption, with soldiers flung into the snow in ways that made survival miraculous. Each blast seemed almost sentient, targeting concentrations of men or vehicles with terrifying precision, making the forest itself a living, lethal opponent. Amidst this chaos, command structure frayed. Communications, already hindered by destroyed radio equipment, now depended on runners and couriers who risked immediate annihilation with each step. Orders to regroup were often received hours too late, arriving at locations that had already been obliterated. Officers tried to enforce discipline, using harsh measures to coerce obedience, but morale had plummeted. Men were physically exhausted and psychologically battered, haunted by the sudden disappearance of comrades, the screams of the wounded, and the pervasive knowledge that an invisible mechanism could strike at any moment. Fear replaced cohesion, improvisation replaced strategy, and survival became the only objective. The German High Command, observing from command posts and mobile headquarters, could do little more than issue desperate, futile directives, knowing full well that the offensive momentum they had counted on was now irretrievably lost. The Americans, observing the fragmentation of German forces, continued to exploit their advantage. Artillery units, protected by terrain and distance, fired in coordinated patterns informed by reconnaissance and radar tracking. The proximity fuses amplified the lethality of every shell, allowing even small-caliber munitions to disrupt and destroy concentrations of troops or vehicles. The forest, already a formidable obstacle, now funneled the German forces into predictable paths, where successive barrages awaited. Observers noted the psychological effects with grim satisfaction. German soldiers moved cautiously, halting frequently, their confidence shattered, their aggression replaced with fear. Every movement carried the weight of imminent death, and this pervasive anxiety eroded the discipline and fighting capability of even seasoned units. In essence, the proximity fuse had not only reshaped tactics, but had fundamentally shifted the battlefield's moral and psychological terrain. By midday, pockets of German forces that had survived the initial onslaught attempted makeshift offensives, hoping to reclaim lost ground or establish defensive positions. These were short-lived and catastrophic. Artillery fire, previously targeted at known approaches, now adapted through observation and radar-assisted calculations, cut down these efforts with ruthless efficiency. Soldiers who had fled the initial wave returned to find their own vehicles destroyed, comrades missing, and landscapes transformed into scenes of devastation. Tales circulated of units being wiped out in succession, as if the invisible enemy had anticipated every move. The proximity fuses had, in effect, created an environment where planning and bravery were subordinated to luck and chance, with survival increasingly dependent on immediate improvisation rather than training or doctrine. Nightfall brought no relief. The forest, already a place of death and destruction, became even more foreboding under darkness. Fires from destroyed vehicles illuminated fleeting shadows, while the cold compounded the misery of the survivors. Exhausted soldiers huddled in shallow depressions or behind ruined structures, listening to the distant echo of artillery and the occasional whistling trajectory of another proximity-fused shell. Yet even these precautions often failed. Survivors recounted moments of stark horror when entire defensive positions were wiped out in a single eruption, with soldiers flung into the snow in ways that made survival miraculous. Each blast seemed almost sentient, targeting concentrations of men or vehicles with terrifying precision, making the forest itself a living, lethal opponent. In retrospect, historians and surviving officers would later note that the Battle of the Bulge had, in its early hours, been decisively shaped by the introduction of proximity-fused munitions. The German command's confidence based on conventional tactics collided disastrously with a technology that rendered prior strategies obsolete. Entire units were lost not to heroic engagement or frontal assault, but to a weapon that required neither aim nor direct contact, only proximity, intelligence, and lethality. The shattered advance of December 17th was not merely a tactical failure. It was a demonstration of the profound impact of innovation on warfare, where technology and psychological dominance could eclipse numerical strength or prior experience. The survivors, few and traumatized, carried forward not only the physical scars of battle, but the knowledge that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. By the dawn of December 18th, the remnants of the German offensive were a shadow of their original strength. The Ardennes, once a corridor for swift armored advance, had become a frozen graveyard punctuated by blackened tanks, shattered trucks, and the scattered remnants of infantry. Commanders, now acutely aware of the scale and lethality of the proximity-fused munitions, faced a daunting task: restore cohesion, salvage forces, and mount a credible offensive against an enemy that seemed capable of anticipating every move. The word desperate had become the defining characteristic of German strategy, as improvisation replaced planning and caution supplanted aggression. The forest, silent yet oppressive, had become both battlefield and executioner, its trees concealing the ever-present threat of invisible shells raining death from above. Officers convened in hastily fortified command posts, poring over maps that had already been rendered obsolete by the relentless efficiency of the American artillery. Reports from surviving units were disjointed, often contradictory, yet painted a harrowing picture. Entire battalions had vanished overnight. Columns of tanks had been obliterated in mid-advance, and scattered infantry was barely capable of coordinated movement. The challenge was immediate and terrifying. Any attempt to concentrate forces for a counterattack risked annihilation, yet dispersal left them too weak to contest the American positions. It was a paradoxical dilemma, exacerbated by the psychological strain on both soldiers and officers. Fear had replaced confidence, and hesitation, once a luxury in warfare, had become a deadly necessity. Even the most seasoned generals struggled to reconcile their traditional doctrines with a reality where a shell could detonate without ever touching its target. Desperate countermeasures began with ingenuity and improvisation. Engineers and technicians, working in freezing conditions, experimented with camouflage and dispersal tactics, attempting to conceal troop movements from the invisible sensors embedded in proximity-fused artillery. Infantry spread into irregular formations, moving individually or in pairs through the snow-laden forest, hoping to avoid detection. Tanks were separated by vast distances and guided along indirect routes, hidden by the trees or diverted into natural depressions. Yet even these precautions offered only partial protection. Every maneuver was fraught with danger, as American radar and observation posts adapted to predict potential approaches, firing shells with devastating precision. The fuses themselves seemed almost sentient to the Germans, striking with uncanny timing, a force that defied comprehension and rendered traditional tactics obsolete. Meanwhile, small pockets of German resistance continued to display remarkable resilience. Commanders attempted to salvage any surviving equipment and rally troops for limited counterattacks. Infantry units scavenged abandoned vehicles, makeshift barricades were erected, and artillery positions hastily relocated. These desperate measures reflected both courage and panic. The men knew that inaction meant death, yet every action carried nearly the same risk. Survivors recounted the surreal horror of moving through terrain littered with the remnants of comrades, navigating between fiery craters and shattered vehicles, all while the invisible threat above maintained its silent dominion. The proximity fuses had redefined survival, transforming even routine movements into life-or-death gambles, where skill and experience mattered less than timing, improvisation, and sheer luck. Attempts at communication and coordination became a battlefield in themselves. Traditional radio lines were unreliable, frequently destroyed or intercepted, forcing reliance on messengers and runners who risked immediate annihilation. Orders were fragmented, often reaching units too late or not at all. Commanders, aware that massed formations were suicidal, increasingly resorted to decentralization, allowing field officers to make immediate tactical decisions. Yet this adaptation was a double-edged sword. While it allowed for some flexibility, it also led to inconsistencies, confusion, and frequent clashes between units acting independently. The German High Command, observing these measures, could do little but record the mounting losses and the increasingly desperate improvisations of their remaining forces. American forces, fully aware of the psychological and tactical disorientation gripping the Germans, exploited every weakness. Proximity-fused artillery continued its devastating effectiveness, with each shell striking concentrations of troops or vehicles at optimal detonation points. Infantry units, shielded by cover and coordination, moved with confidence, observing the disarray of the enemy with grim precision. The destruction of German supply lines further compounded the crisis. Trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and provisions were systematically destroyed, leaving survivors cold, hungry, and demoralized. By the evening of December 18th, the German effort had shifted entirely from advancing to survival. The forest, already transformed into a landscape of death, had become an oppressive prison, where every movement was a negotiation with invisible, omnipresent power. As night fell, German commanders convened once more, attempting to formulate a response to the relentless and precise American fire. Discussions centered on dispersal, camouflage, and staggered movements, yet all recognized a stark truth: the proximity fuse had rendered conventional strategies ineffective. Morale, already shattered, reached new lows as officers recounted the stories of entire companies wiped out without warning, and survivors struggled to find shelter in the frozen, fire-scarred forest. The countermeasures, though resourceful, were insufficient to restore operational momentum. The Germans were no longer advancing, they were surviving, moving cautiously, improvising constantly, and hoping against hope that the invisible threat would not find them next. By December 19th, the Ardennes offensive had become an exercise in desperation, marked not by strategic brilliance but by sheer, survival-driven chaos. German forces, once confident in their carefully plotted routes and precise timing, were now fractured into isolated contingents scattered across the snow-laden forests. Commanders, unable to coordinate movements effectively, relied on fragmented reports and gut instinct to guide their remaining troops. The proximity-fused shells had transformed the battlefield into a lethal maze. Conventional tactics were no longer applicable. Where once armored columns moved with certainty, only cautious, irregular movements remained. Where once troops had marched confidently along roads and trails, now they crept, zigzagging through woods, avoiding obvious paths, and hoping that luck would protect them. Supply lines, already strained by terrain and weather, were now catastrophically disrupted. Ammunition trucks, fuel convoys, and rations had been decimated in earlier barrages, leaving soldiers to scavenge the wreckage for anything usable. Men subsisted on frozen scraps, relying on adrenaline and sheer willpower to press forward. Even medical support was virtually non-existent. Field hospitals had been destroyed, and the wounded either froze in place or were left to crawl through snow in search of aid. The forest seemed indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to uniforms, ranks, or allegiance. Every step was treacherous, every flash of movement potentially fatal, and every sound, metal tearing, branches snapping, or distant explosions, carried a weight of terror that gnawed at sanity. In this environment, discipline disintegrated rapidly. Soldiers abandoned positions without orders, fled independently, or engaged in chaotic skirmishes with both the enemy and the elements. Entire companies ceased to exist as identifiable units, dissolving into fragmented bands of survivors struggling to navigate snow-laden forests, frozen streams, and cratered landscapes. Officers attempted to impose structure, issuing directives to consolidate forces or occupy defensive positions, yet their authority was undermined by constant losses and the ever-present threat of proximity-fused artillery. The traditional hierarchy of command had become almost irrelevant. Survival dictated action, improvisation supplanted strategy, and cohesion had been replaced by fear. American forces, observing the ongoing collapse, capitalized fully on the chaos. Artillery units benefiting from radar and observation struck with terrifying accuracy. Each shell, timed and detonated via proximity fuse, tore through concentrations of German troops, vehicles, and improvised fortifications. Even attempts at retreat along seemingly safer routes were met with devastating fire. Convoys of trucks and abandoned tanks were shattered in mid-motion, and retreating infantry faced explosions that left few survivors. The efficiency of the proximity fuse was not just physical, but psychological. German soldiers learned to fear the very ground they moved upon, every snow-covered clearing potentially hiding death from above. Panic became contagious, and morale, already eroded by repeated catastrophic losses, reached a nadir. Amid the collapse, individual acts of courage and desperation emerged. Small groups of German soldiers, realizing that survival depended on stealth, moved silently through the forest, scavenging weapons, ammunition, and provisions from the wreckage. Engineers attempted to disable or divert unexploded shells, while medics worked frantically to assist the injured despite freezing temperatures. Yet even these heroic efforts were often futile. Proximity-fused shells continued to detonate unpredictably, reducing fortifications, vehicles, and human effort alike to nothingness. Survivors spoke of explosions that seemed almost sentient, as if the weapon anticipated every attempt to resist or regroup, striking with precision and timing that defied understanding. The Ardennes had become a surreal theater where ingenuity and bravery were overshadowed by invisible, omnipresent lethality. Communication, already a fragile lifeline, disintegrated entirely. Radio equipment destroyed or disrupted by artillery left officers unable to coordinate effectively. Couriers and runners attempting to carry messages between fragmented units faced near certain death, and many never returned. The breakdown of command compounded confusion and disorientation. Orders sent to consolidate forces or occupy strategic positions often reached empty clearings, snow-covered craters, or ruined buildings. In their absence, troops made ad hoc decisions, retreating along unplanned routes, seeking temporary shelter, or abandoning movement altogether. The forest, layered with snow and scarred by fire, became a labyrinth where strategy yielded to instinct and survival instincts overrode obedience. By late afternoon, entire sectors of the Ardennes were effectively unoccupied by organized German forces. Units that had survived the initial onslaught now moved in small, isolated clusters, attempting to evade further destruction. Some took refuge in natural depressions, tree hollows, or ruined buildings, hiding until nightfall to avoid detection. Others attempted to regroup along secondary roads, only to be met with renewed artillery fire, the proximity fuses detonating with devastating precision. Vehicles, if still operational, were abandoned as liabilities. Men moved on foot, carrying as much as they could salvage while leaving behind heavy equipment. Retreat had replaced advance, survival had replaced offensive strategy, and the German High Command could do little but observe the rapid disintegration of their meticulously prepared operation. American forces, maintaining relentless pressure, systematically exploited this disarray. Observation posts and radar stations tracked fragmented movements, and artillery was deployed to intercept and annihilate fleeing units. Infantry, benefiting from both cover and coordination, secured captured positions with minimal resistance, often encountering only scattered, exhausted survivors. The psychological impact of the proximity fuse was apparent. German troops moved cautiously, hesitantly, and with visible fear, fully aware that concentration or rash movements could bring instant destruction. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of strategy to a contest of survival, with the invisible enemy dictating every step, every decision, and every outcome. By evening, the German retreat had become general. The Ardennes, covered in snow and littered with wreckage, echoed with the distant, intermittent thunder of artillery. The proximity fuses had achieved total dominance over the battlefield, obliterating not only men and equipment, but the very initiative of the German forces. What remained of the Ardennes offensive was a scattered, improvisational withdrawal, punctuated by constant fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Survivors trudged through snow, carrying the wounded or abandoned supplies, hiding from the ever-present threat, and adapting to a battlefield that had become unpredictable, deadly, and alien. Every step was a negotiation with death, every nightfall a temporary reprieve from the relentless destruction. By the end of Part 5, it was clear that the Ardennes offensive was no longer a contest of force or strategy. It had collapsed entirely. German units were fragmented, morale had disintegrated, and the survivors were united only by the imperative to live. The proximity-fused artillery had reshaped the battlefield, creating an environment where concentration meant death and improvisation meant the chance of survival. The forest, once a corridor of potential victory, had become a vast, lethal trap where every movement was fraught with peril, and every sound could herald annihilation.
Akshay Kumar, 09-10-2025, 11:04. The Ardennes, in the cold light of December 20th, lay silent and scarred. Where German formations had once moved with precision and purpose, now only the remnants of shattered troops, burned-out vehicles, and cratered snowfields remained. The forest, dense and white, seemed almost indifferent to the suffering that had occurred within its confines. Trees, splintered by explosions, cast jagged shadows over frozen rivers and shattered roads. Smoke from burning equipment and abandoned vehicles curled upward, mixing with the chill fog that had settled over the battlefield. For the German forces, the offensive was no longer a plan of conquest. It was a memory of devastation, a lesson in vulnerability, and a testament to the lethal efficiency of unseen technology. Survivors, those few who had evaded the invisible reach of proximity-fused artillery, moved cautiously through the wreckage. The landscape was both a refuge and a threat, hiding patches of snow-covered debris, frozen craters, and remnants of men and vehicles alike. Soldiers scavenged what they could from destroyed supply lines, dragging frozen rations, ammunition, and weapons to sustain themselves. Field medics worked tirelessly, attempting to treat frostbite, wounds, and shock, often improvising with whatever material survived. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers recounted the sudden disappearance of comrades, the terrifying unpredictability of explosions, and the constant pressure of being hunted by an invisible force. Many would carry the memory of this day for the rest of their lives, haunted not only by death, but by the helplessness they felt against a weapon they could neither see nor anticipate. The German High Command faced a crisis of strategy and credibility. Orders that had once flowed with precision were now impossible to execute. Staff officers pored over maps showing fragmented units, destroyed vehicles, and impassable terrain. Efforts to reorganize the remaining troops were hampered by communication breakdowns, decimated supply lines, and the pervasive fear gripping the men. Commanders debated alternative approaches. Could regrouping offer a second chance, or would it only invite further annihilation? Every potential solution was undermined by the reality of the proximity fuse, a weapon that had made traditional doctrine irrelevant. The initial confidence of planners, who had envisioned rapid advancement and decisive strikes, now seemed almost naive in retrospect. They confronted a battlefield where technology had decisively rewritten the rules of engagement. American forces, having maintained the initiative, systematically consolidated their positions. Observation posts and radar-guided artillery had not only inflicted casualties, but had instilled lasting psychological dominance over the German troops. Every movement, every attempt at regrouping was scrutinized and, when necessary, punished with devastating efficiency. For the Allies, the battle had demonstrated the potential of technological innovation to multiply combat effectiveness, disrupt enemy morale, and reduce the reliance on sheer numerical superiority. The proximity fuse, though small in size, had amplified the effectiveness of artillery beyond expectations, transforming conventional warfare into a contest defined by anticipation, precision, and invisible lethality. In the aftermath, the human toll became starkly apparent. Entire regiments had been annihilated, leaving skeletal units to navigate a landscape marked by carnage. The snow, mixed with blood and blackened debris, bore witness to the scale of destruction. Soldiers grappled with grief for lost comrades, the trauma of sudden explosions, and the psychological shock of confronting a weapon that had no visible presence. The survivors were physically exhausted, their bodies battered by cold, wounds, and deprivation, yet the psychological wounds ran deeper. Many described the experience as surreal. The forest, heavy with snow and scarred by fire, had become a sentient entity capable of annihilating formations at will. Nightmares, tremors, and pervasive fear would follow them long after the battle, a testament to the unprecedented impact of proximity-fused weaponry on both battlefield and psyche. Efforts to document and analyze the events began almost immediately. Field officers wrote reports detailing the destruction, the effectiveness of the proximity fuses, and the collapse of conventional tactics. Engineers and technical specialists examined unexploded shells, attempting to understand the mechanism that had wrought such devastation. Questions abounded. How could a weapon detonate without impact? How could it seem to anticipate movements? How could such small devices wield such enormous tactical and psychological influence? Even experienced generals struggled to reconcile their understanding of warfare with the lessons imposed by this technological marvel. The answers would shape not only the remainder of the Ardennes campaign, but future doctrines of artillery, strategy, and military innovation for years to come. The surviving German troops, forced to retreat further into the Ardennes or consolidate along secondary defensive lines, faced the grim realization that their losses were both quantitative and qualitative. Losses were measured not only in men and vehicles, but in initiative, cohesion, and confidence. Trust in leadership had eroded under the strain of annihilation and confusion. The Ardennes offensive, once conceived as a decisive blow, had become a study in the fragility of military assumptions in the face of technological evolution. By December 21st, the forest was quiet, though its scars remained vivid. Craters punctuated snowfields, blackened trees cast long shadows, and abandoned equipment lay scattered like grotesque monuments to defeat. The surviving German soldiers trudged along winding paths, carrying what they could salvage and burying the fallen where they could, though often leaving them where they fell. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt fuel, blood, and cold. In whispered conversations, men recounted the suddenness of death, the eerie precision of the explosions, and the invisible nature of the threat. These narratives, passed along units and recorded in journals, would form a collective memory of fear, adaptation, and the overwhelming power of proximity-fused artillery. In reflection, the Ardennes battlefields offered a stark demonstration of how innovation could decisively alter combat outcomes. The proximity fuse, though small in size, had amplified the effectiveness of artillery beyond expectations, transforming conventional warfare into a contest defined by anticipation, precision, and invisible lethality.